Hello and welcome back to What's on Tap with Mayari. My name is Mayari and today I will be your guide on wine, beer, and why they have flavor. Where does this flavor come from? What's going on? Why does this wine taste good and this wine taste bad? We're gonna dig into it today, and we're gonna start with the first thing, which will be the ingredients. So we're gonna start with beer and then we'll go to wine and we'll talk about all the things. All right, so first is the flavor of beer. Where does beer get its flavor from? And maybe this could even answer why I like certain styles and why I don't, as in, obviously, you guys. Okay, so the ingredients in beer is literally just water, malt, hops, and yeast. That's pretty much it. Anything else that's being added is extra for the purpose of flavor. And so malt is kind of the important part here for me, because malt, I like to liken it to coffee. You know how coffee has like different roast? It'll have, your light roast coffee to your dark roast, and there's a whole bunch of different ones in between with many names. So malt is the same way. Malt is toasted barley. So they take barley and they toast it, and then it kind of comes in these different categories. So we have a lighter toasted barley all the way up to a super dark toasted barley. And now we have malt. Some brewers like to use like extracts, or, maybe they'll take a light roasted malt and then mix it with a little bit of darker roasted extract, whatever. There's a whole bunch of different ways to get flavor, but this is kind of the foundation of it, because in malt is where we're gonna get our levels of like caramel and kind of those darker notes. So if we have a super toasted malt, that means that we're having like a stout, we're having a porter, those really dark beers. That's how we get those darker beers. If we're having something really light, like a wheat ale, they're gonna mix it obviously with some wheat, but it's also gonna be a lighter toasted malt. All right, so that's kind of like the basic like ground level, I don't know, so whatever, something like that. Okay, cool. So that's how we get the flavor from the malt. The second thing is water. Water is an ingredient. We don't really think about water as an ingredient, but it is, especially when we're doing coffee, we're doing hot chocolate, we're doing beers, we're doing wine. Water in different places, coming from different sources, has different levels of minerals inside of it. And so that's why sometimes you'll hear people say like, the water here is too hard. What they're talking about is the mineral content in the water. It means that it's really dense. There's like a lot of minerals in this water, which is changing the flavor of my product. I think a really popular example is like bagels, right? They're like, New York bagels are the best, but the water's from Jersey, right? Like they're saying these things because the water that they're using to make bagels or whatever, it's all dependent on the mineral content. So that's kind of the importance of water. It's a foundational structure to building our beer. Okay, so we did water, we did malt. The next one is yeast. Yeast has its own flavors. We talked about like ambient yeast, just like hanging out. They have their own flavors. There's yeast in barns. I think we talked about like lambic style beers and all these different kinds of beers where the yeast in the environment is giving off different flavors. And so yeast will impart flavors like banana. It'll impart flavors like, some people are like, oh, this beer tastes like, I don't know, it tastes like Bananas Foster to me. Like, why do I get that taste on the back end? That's actually a flavor imparted from the yeast. So as you can see, there's like all these different ways and nuances that are going to impact our final product. So when we start thinking about beer today, we have awesome brewers and little microbreweries and all these people doing really cool stuff like donut beer and like, I had one the other day, it was like potato chip beer. It's delicious, it's great. And so how do they do this? Well, essentially they're adding in this product, like they're dumping a bag of potato chips during the beer making process, of course, and usually what they're doing is they're pouring the almost finished beer product on top of cakes, donuts, gummy bears, whatever. And so that's how they're getting that flavor. They're not like boiling it in there with it, if that makes sense. Okay, so we talked about beer and kind of how it gets its flavor. Now we're gonna go to wine. Wine is a little bit more complicated. I'm sorry to tell you, it's not as easygoing as like we're gonna add some pears into our Sauvignon Blanc, and that's why we have this pear flavor. It's not happening like that. Wine is very complicated. It's like a mystery puzzle. And so we'll talk about kind of the ingredients, which is just grape juice. There's nothing else going on in wine besides grape juice and yeast. So why does wine taste so different to so many different people? And the answer is you. It's your brain. It's your brain chemistry interacting with the different compounds in the wine. So let's reverse for a second and try to go back and figure out why that's happening, okay? So essentially these compounds, we have different names, scientific names, we're not gonna get into it, but these names are names of different flavor compounds. So some wines, so example, we'll say Cabernet. Some people are like, this tastes like blackberries to me, or like overripe blackberries. Well, it tastes like that to you because there are certain atoms coming together, bonding, hanging out, tying themselves to each other. And to you, when you smell that, you're smelling blackberries. And so to me, maybe I'm smelling raspberries, or maybe I'm smelling cranberries. That is all dependent on your olfactory senses, which is essentially just your nose, because flavor comes from what you're smelling, not necessarily what you're tasting. That's why, like, if you're having disgusting medicine and you like plug your nose and you're just like, oh, I'm gonna drink it really fast, you can't really taste it. You taste this, like, you taste the sweetness, but you don't really pick up on like the distinct flavors of the atrocious medicine, right? So that's because it's coming from your nose. So if you're not smelling anything, you're not gonna pick up on the flavors. And so now we can see how this opens up like a whole new world, because you and I could smell something and pick up on two totally different things. And that's just like our genetics, it's our brain chemistry, it's what our body decides to pick up on. So when talking about wine and the different flavors of it, of course we have the yeast playing a factor. What kind of yeast the winemaker uses is going to determine what flavors it's going to give off, and all of that is measured and calculated for the most part. Obviously, the second thing is the style of grape. So, a Moscato grape is super, super aromatic. Like, you can smell Moscato grapes growing. It smells like perfume. It smells just like sweet honey and like delicious apples. It smells like you're walking through an apple orchard almost, and then you're like, oh, these are grapes? Yeah, that's Moscato. It's delicious. So the different grapes are gonna give you those different like sweetness levels, the different tannin levels, and then their own distinct qualities. Then it's the yeast, but the rest is kind of just up to you. So yeah, we could go into maybe some more scientific stuff at another time, but that's like the baseline here. So now when we're thinking about flavor in wine and beer and how that relates to like different styles and how we're pairing it together, it's kind of essential just to understand that like your brain chemistry is going to make you taste something than how I'm going to taste it, and that's totally cool. And that's why the art of food pairing is so vast, and there's so many books and there's so many different people talking about it, because everyone has a different flavor profile and a different just way of smelling and tasting things. So pairings. So when we're talking about pairing, we'll use a specific example, and then we'll kind of go off into different directions from there. So we'll start with something that people think is very difficult to pair, which is fish. Everyone is like, you can only have white wine with fish because fish only likes white wine. Okay, and the reason that fish and white wine go together usually pretty seamlessly is because when you're pairing beer, wine, whatever, cocktails with your food, there's certain things that you have to like keep in mind. And the first thing is intensity. How intense is this food that I'm eating? Am I eating like scallops and bacon? That's like intense flavors. Those are fatty, rich dishes. And so you need a wine that can handle that, or a beer or whatever. And the way that you measure how can my beverage match up to my dish is intensity, it's fat content and its sweetness. Those are kind of like the baselines, right? So if you're gonna eat, let's say you're doing your scallops and your bacon. So the bacon is like salty and it's fatty, delicious. Now the scallops have this kind of like sweetness. They're salty too, but they have sweetness to it. And so when thinking of what kind of drink am I gonna have with that, you have to decide, do I want to bring out the scallops in this dish or do I wanna bring out the bacon? So there's a lot of decisions to be made. So let's say we decide we're gonna wanna bring out the scallops. Okay. So the scallops are sweet, so we want something that has a finishing sweetness to it. So if we're gonna do, let's say, a wine, for example, a white wine might be something like a Chardonnay. An oaked Chardonnay would meet that intensity of the bacon and all of the fat. Okay. Let's say we wanted to do a beer, then you're not gonna wanna do like an IPA. You're probably you probably would like to do something that's a little bit citrusy because the citrus is going to cut through the fat, but it's not going to overpower the bacon and the scallop like an IPA would because it has a lot of bitterness and these other things going on. So those two wouldn't really be friends. But like a citrusy beer, I'm trying to think of an example. Like Blue Moon, it's kind of like a nice, like crisp wheat ale. It has a little orange flavor. That would go really nice because that's bringing out that scallop flavor. So another example is, let's say, like dessert. A lot of people, they're like, chocolate and Cabernet go together, and that is the pair. Have you ever had that? That's not good. It tastes bad. They don't taste good together. Cabernet is it's very much like, I'm here, I'm Cabernet, and, you know, this is me. Take it or leave it. And chocolate is exactly the same way. If you put chocolate on a dish, chocolate is taken over the dish. It's like, I'm here. Everyone can just relax because I'm here now, right? So putting those two together, when we just spoke about you want to match intensity with intensity, initially makes sense, but now we also have to think about what we're actually eating. So if you're eating like a chocolate cake with a raspberry filling, okay, Cabernet can withstand that. And the sharpness from the raspberry filling is gonna go really well with the astringency in the Cabernet. But if you're just having like a chocolate cake with like a ganache on top, the Cabernet is not really gonna go well with that because the chocolate flavor in the ganache is so strong that they're just gonna kind of fight. And they're fighting together on your palate and you're like, this isn't good. So you're probably just gonna eat the whole cake and then drink the rest of the wine and then be on your merry way. So in that case, I would say something like a Pinot Noir would make more sense. A Sauvignon Blanc might even make more sense depending on where it's from. So these are kind of the little hiccups that we run into when it comes to food pairing, which is why there's so many different options and so many different ways to go about it. Now, let's say you are a red wine drinker, you only like red wine, and you're going out to a seafood restaurant, and you're just like, I already know they're gonna try to make me drink some Sauvignon Blanc, some Chardonnay, and I don't want it. You do have options. Of course, you can always drink whatever you want. Don't let anybody tell you different. But I would suggest just matching your fat content with your intensity. So if you're gonna have salmon, which is like a higher, fattier fish, then you can do a more astringent red wine. I wouldn't go any darker or any more powerful than Pinot Noir. I would go from Pinot Noir up. So what kinds of wines are those? Those are the wines that you're gonna find from France, from Portugal, and from like cooler temperature wines. So not like a big hot growing area, nothing from like South America, nothing from New Zealand or Australia. It's too hot, and those wines have a lot more astringency, a lot more power because they have more sugar in them. So like cooler temperature wine. So if you're at a really classy restaurant and you're at a seafood restaurant, just ask the server, be like, I like red wine and I want something from like a cooler temperature area. So they might give you something from Oregon, something from Washington State. Again, something from Portugal or France. Those are like the reds that I would stick to when trying to pair it up with something like fish. Okay, so I forgot. That's it for today, guys. Just a little 101 on flavor, why beer tastes the way it does, why wines taste the way they do, and a little intro on how that can come together with your food pairing. So we'll talk about this more as we go on, and I hope you learned something fun today. Thanks for watching.